it if
or any De Palma movie. Hi, Jill.
Hey everyone. We're live.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Welcome. It's nice to see you for tonight's discussion of In a Lonely Place. We got a number of questions and comments in advance, so we are looking forward to a particularly lively discussion because I don't know if I can say the opinions ran the gamut, but there was a diversity of comments and opinions. So we look forward to discussing those thoughts and others. Just a few reminders, if you could please keep your audio on mute unless and until I call on you to make your comment or ask your question. The way I will know to call on you is you can use the raise hand function within Zoom, and I will use that to call on you. At that point, please unmute yourself, and when you're done asking your question or making your comment, please mute yourself again to allow Lisa and me to respond. And the chat function will be alive and well, and our colleague Jill will be checking that, and it's a great chance for you all to chat with each other or raise additional points or even share a link if you have a good resource for something that is being discussed. But please keep it nice and friendly and clean in there. We would appreciate that. Abuse Lisa and me all you want, but keep the chat section. No, please don't do that. Anyway, that is about that. And so I think we can now get started. I see right off the bat, we already have a comment or question from David. So David, start us off.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yes.
Yes.
I guess I'm going to start it. It might or might not be similar to your comments, a little more controversial than my usual comments. We did not really think this was a great Bogart movie. We didn't really find it to be as well made as others that we've seen. And I guess at some level, I'll spark some controversy perhaps and see what other people thought in terms of the quality of the movie and the quality of the writing of the script. It seemed like it was, we want to get Bogey to say the Bogey lines, but tying some of the rest of it together, we didn't do as well as they could have and as many of these films did. Just as a sideline, we happened to notice that of the stars, many, I'd almost say most of the 4 or 5, a majority of the 4 or 5, 6 top stars all died young. And that was just sort of a side observation. And that'll be my comment for now, and let the discussions begin.
Well, thank you, David. I trust you're not suggesting that they died young as punishment for being in a film that you found to be substandard.
No, not that.
just a coincidence. Okay. I think that you have raised some points that are not going to be rare or unique among the comments we will hear today. And I think that there are a number, you sort of opened the door, which is great for a first comment, and I'm glad you did. I will simply say that I would have to agree with you that this movie is different in a host of ways from the sort of typical studio fare or even typical Bogart fare of the time. I say studio fare because this was a film produced by Bogart's production company. And that means that he and his producing partner basically sort of put the pieces together, and it was distributed by Columbia, but it was an independent production. So that right there makes it different. I find it interesting that you didn't think this was sort of as strong as many other Bogart movies from the Bogart perspective, because many people think this is his best acting performance, you know, over his career. So I think that, you know, standards change over time, impressions change over time. This movie, I think what we can all agree on, this movie is a departure. Whether it's a departure in an interesting and positive way or departure in a disappointing way, I think that's probably where the bulk of our discussion will be. Lisa, your thoughts?
I mean, I co-sign everything you said, and I'm curious to hear other people's thoughts about the script, because I find the script to be one of the sharpest elements of the film. I mean, to say that it rivals screwball comedy is a sort of silly thing to say, perhaps, but the script is crackling and shapes these characters so well. You know, considering we only get little pieces about their backstory, but because they're woven into the script so elegantly, we feel like we know these people. And so I would be curious to hear other comments on the script, or perhaps more pointed criticisms of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the screenplay, in a way, the screenplay is sort of analogous to the screenplay that Dix is, writing, in that it's based on a novel, but he threw out much of it. Much of it was thrown out to focus on certain core elements. I think one difference is that a lot of the original Dorothy Hughes novel was thrown out because it probably could not have been, standards of the time would not have allowed it to be filmed that way at the time. But I think it's a spare script, but I think, there are lines that really crackle, and there's some sort of sharp cynicism. I don't think it's as good in the dialogue department as Sunset Boulevard, another film about the same topic, roughly the same topic from the same year. But I think saying that dialogue isn't as good as Billy Wilder's dialogue leaves a lot of room for the dialogue to still be pretty darn good. So yeah, I find the screenplay criticism particularly surprising.
I'll just, Andrew, do you mind if I quickly add on to that? The original script for this film was a much more straightforward adaptation of Dorothy Hughes's novel, but the Hayes office essentially said, no, you can't do that. So it did evolve over time. And in fact, Nicholas Ray had a lot of revisions on set even for the script as it evolved. Just thought I'd add that.
Thank you. Joss, do you have a question or comment? Joss, are you there?
I thought some of the, yeah, I'm here. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Some observations. I thought some of the dialogue was right on. It was clever, pithy. I think Dick Steele's character reflected several of Bogart's earlier typical performances. Sam Spade, Rick in Casablanca, but there were some disorienting aspects to it as well. I mean, his rage and his anger, his short trigger anger, some of his craziness, which we saw in other Bogart films like Treasure of Sierra Madre, or his sort of eccentric behavior that maybe came up in The African Queen. So, there are other examples of this sort of off-kilter performance that not the typical hard-edged, hard-boiled tough guy that we come to expect from Bogart. Also, there was I don't remember if Lisa, you mentioned it. I don't know if you mentioned this in your introduction or if I read it somewhere, but there's also a shift of sympathy, a shift of focus initially from Bogart's character to his girlfriend, and it was maybe an earlier example of something we see later in something like Psycho, where the point of view shifts several times from one character to another, and our sympathies shift several times from one character to another.
Joss, that's a really great observation, and thank you for making it. And that can be part of what keeps people at a distance from this film. That at the beginning, you're asked to identify with an unsavory fellow. I think he gets more unsavory as the film goes on, and he's at his most unsavory, or at least savory, when by the time the identification has shifted, as you very sharply pointed out, Joss. But that being said, that is a way that keeps audiences at a distance, and then shifting that identity, sort of who do you care about, who are you following, whose story is this, changes, and that's a sort of a tall order for an audience, and especially given the stylistic and generic and industry sort of relative narrow focus of tools and approaches available to, even though it's technically an independent production, a studio film in 1950. So I think we're starting to get at some of the issues that prevent the sort of embracing of the movie compared to some others. Lisa.
Joss, thank you for your observations. I really enjoyed hearing them, and I'm really glad that you brought up these other bogey roles. And this was definitely, at least in my estimation, and it seems like many others, an example of Bogart fully playing off his persona. You have not just the Bogart persona in 40s movies. I guess he's the template on which so many others came, but you have this preponderance of, world-weary, tough, cynical, masculine guys who, find something to care about, even though they act like they don't care about anything. Quick with a quip, charming, but prone to violence, but the right kind of violence because they're beating up bad guys. Like this type just, endless movies feature this type and glamorize this type. And this type is embodied by Humphrey Bogart. That is his persona. And the fact that you start off in this film so closely identified with Humphrey Bogart, with Dick Steele, you're in the driver's seat with him, you are him, essentially. And he's, opinions may vary, but he's very charming and cynical in that Humphrey Bogart persona type of way in the beginning of the film, and then the film just breaks down that glamorized persona bit by bit until there is nothing left, and at the very end he is the last person you the viewer wants to be associated with. I find the Humphrey Bogart performance in this film to be the most complex and interesting play off of someone's persona perhaps that I've ever seen. And you mentioned Treasure of Sierra Madre. Like clearly Humphrey Bogart has played, bad guys, evil guys, jerks. But what differentiates this role from other performances where he is the villain is that he starts off as Humphrey Bogart, as we know him. He starts off glamorous in a way. Opinions may vary, again. In Treasure of Sierra Madre, he's kind of dumb and, jerk, slovenly from the start. Like there's no evolution or de-evolution. Here, it's just so elegant how he shifts from the persona to what is actually behind that persona. Andrew, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that's sort of, again, I also think, I talked about distancing before, I also think some of the differences in opinions of this film is whether one is looking at this film sort of as only within the text itself. And that's a movie should stand based on knowing nothing except what the movie tells you. And if this movie isn't satisfying to people or doesn't stand for people in that way, then that is a mark against it. That being said, I think a lot of the reasons why people who do like it, the reason Lisa and I think of it what we do, the reason it's on the National Film Registry and lots of other great lists, is because people are thinking about it as a product of certain people at a certain time, and it stands out in that regard. And again, a movie really needs to succeed or fail on its own merits as a sort of closed text. But there are other avenues for appreciation. I think that's probably where some of the appreciation for this film lies. James, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I really enjoyed the film, and I thought it was interesting that at the beginning of the film, it seems like, whether or not he murdered the Kochek girl was kind of the core of the film, but then, and you think he's innocent, and then later you think maybe he's guilty, but then by the time he's shown to be innocent, it kind of seems completely irrelevant to anything. And it was just quite interesting how it seemed to be such a central part of the film, and then you realize at the end that actually you've completely lost the focus on that particular crime, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially a MacGuffin, which is a device made most famous by Hitchcock, which is sort of thought of as the engine that powers the story. It's the thing that gets the characters to do the things we want to see the characters do, or we want the characters to go through, but the specific nature of that thing doesn't matter. We needed the murder in the story to bring the two of them together, to push his buttons, to see how he reacts, to test his relationships with Gloria Graham and other people. But one of the things I found interesting about some of the comments we received in advance was, to me, I never thought he did it. I never thought the film was trying to get me to think he did it. And so, a man who's driven, I mean, he overreacts and he shouldn't get violent with people, but a man who's frustrated and or paranoid because the police are after him for a crime he didn't commit, I have a little more sympathy for that maybe than some. So, or is it empathy? It's never happened to me, whichever's the right one. But I think that part of the reason, to me anyway, it seemed resolved so quickly is because it is a MacGuffin. It's meant to sort of, be the engine that drives the rest of the film. Lisa.
It's a MacGuffin, but I would also argue that it's pretty central to one of the film's biggest themes, which is that violence exists within men, and violence exists within normal men. Like and the film is so subtle on so many of its themes, but it's very subtle on this one. But there are just so many instances woven throughout the film where you are presented with ostensibly a normal man, or as the police chief hands Laurel a stack of pictures of men and says, "Hey, look at these. Are these murderers?" She says, "No, they look like normal men. They're all murderers." And one of the really compelling things about this film to me is that it suggests that the dark underbelly of masculinity is violence against women. Like this film is very concerned with male violence against women. And I really love the idea that, yes, it's a MacGuffin, the identity of the murderer of Mildred, but in a way it's very fitting with the film's thesis that this normal looking dapper man, Kessler, is a killer. And there's so many little instances of that woven throughout. I think it's just as important as a thematic point as it is, as Andrew says, a MacGuffin.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, the MacGuffin is supposed to be, a device. The specific nature of it doesn't really matter, but I think you're right that it had to be this sort of crime that he is accused of, because those are important themes of the film. I think that's a good point. Linda, you have a question or comment?
Unmute. Okay. Thank you. First of all, I want to say, I really enjoyed your programs here every Monday at 6:30. So thank you for that. And Lisa, thank you for picking this film. I've seen it before, and you pointed out some elements that made me look at different things this time when I watched. And I have to say that I think this film is about trust. I think that this is Bogart, and I read a review of the film where they indicated that Lauren Bacall was of influence in terms of Bogey picking this as something he wanted to produce. And I could see that there's a sense of depth to his character that kind of is a precursor for like the Caine Mutiny, where he comes out of this I'm a gangster kind of acting role into more depth. And to me, this is like the beginning of, I want to do more than just be stereotypical gangster. And I must say that I found it interesting that Gloria Graham, who has her highlights in life outside of acting, if you read about her, was also kind of colorful in a way. I mean, I don't know that it was prior to this film because she may have continued afterward, but Bogart became more mature from 1950, throughout the rest of his career. So I found this film to be kind of his catharsis to, I don't want to be that other guy anymore. I want to be a different guy. And he's sort of moving on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think there's more to this character than there is to Sam Spade. And, Sam Spade was sort of rough on the outside, but decent on the inside. And this guy is, a mix of both outside and in. He's delightful to that past his prime actor. And he can be a sort of stand up for certain things he believes, but he can also obviously be extremely atrocious in his behavior. And inside, he can be motivated by good things, but also by the same sort of petty weaknesses that quote unquote normal people can. And I think that's sort of what you're getting at, is that this is a complex figure, a complex character, which most studio characters aren't at that time in particular. And he hadn't played many of them during his career, but it makes for a messier film. Lisa.
Humphrey Bogart was ambivalent about his craft. He didn't really like watching his movies all the time. He had a lot of ambivalence, I guess is the right word, about his craft. And I think that you identified this pivot point very nicely. I would like to think that he really was looking for something he could sink his teeth in and get really deep and complex with. It's one of the most, this film is 70 years old, and this is one of the most mature and adult commentaries on a relationship, even with the heightened excess, I suppose, of him being a potential murderer. It's just so complex and deep, and it really does reward multiple viewings, because you pick up so much more from the performances every time. So yes, I appreciate your comments about Bogart in this role.
Lisa Marie, you have a question or comment?
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, my mind goes right to a bipolar condition that they didn't have a label for back then. With the complexity of his kindness and his good heart to defend people that he loved, and also just snapping in the next second, being filled with love and compassion, then snapping into rage. I think this movie is a foreshadowing of a label that we have now on a condition called bipolar. And I thought Bogart was like amazing. I've never seen this movie before, and I've seen some of his other films, and he has not acted this complex before. And then the other thing that I wanted to bring up is, with what we're experiencing in our world today with racism, the roles of Black Americans in this film, being the driver of the car and the worker who is cleaning the sidewalks, and then Hatta Brooks, who is just stunning in this film. Her voice is beautiful. She's beautiful. Are you aware of her career and how she's impacted our world?
No.
You should look her up. You should look her up. She's amazing. She's not alive anymore, but she's amazing.
Well, thank you for that suggestion and for your other comments, Lisa Marie. I think you regarding the depictions of African Americans, this has come up before, and if you're going to be looking at American movies, particularly Hollywood movies from many, many decades over the past century, we unfortunately are going to find that African Americans are marginalized in the depictions, very limited in the depictions. And that is something that Hollywood has to be, in the history of Hollywood, it has to be accountable for. And, it's a good reminder of where the society was and where the industry was at different times. I'm sorry. Regarding your point about Bogart's sort of mental condition or the sort of suspicion of his mental condition is an interesting point. Someone brought up in an emailed comment that they tied this to his wartime service and saw his behavior as some sort of related to post-traumatic stress or something like that. I found that interesting. It hadn't occurred to me, I guess, because the cop who's his war buddy, describes him in such glowing terms, his service in such glowing terms, and it doesn't seem to occur to him. But I guess it's a possible connection as well. But in either case, it's a sort of, as Lisa was saying, it's an exaggeration, and it's an overly dramatic, overly dramatized, overly visual, overly graphic representation of something that afflicts almost everybody who walks the earth in usually, hopefully, much smaller degrees, which is we always hurt the ones we love, right? We either because of proximity or because of comfort or because of something far more deeper and more complicated, each of us has said something or done something to the person we love the most in the world that we wish we hadn't. And that is a very common thing, that is a very human thing. And that is part of what this film is exploring, and part of why, in particular, for Nicholas Ray, it was such an interesting, a film of such interest to him. But this movie obviously makes it a much graver, grander, and more violent means of hurting, in part because that's what movies do. Lisa.
Quickly, just to kind of touch on a different point that Lisa Marie did bring up briefly. I patting someone on the back in 1950 for casting 2 Black actors in marginal roles seems odd today, but Nick Ray did consider himself a Hollywood liberal and really wanted to cast African-American actors in roles. I understand there are very limited roles, but yes, bringing up Hatta Brooks, I wanted to point out that Nick Ray did want to cast minorities. Clearly they're in very marginal roles, but perhaps small steps. I co-sign everything else you said, Andrew, especially about the wartime trauma that is, again, very subtly but powerfully woven through this film. There are so many little instances of this film pointing to Dick's pre-existing condition. The film is not suggesting that he was some peace-loving, teddy bear before the war. But there are so many little instances of the film pointing to the trauma of coming back from the war that is exacerbating his perhaps pre-existing violent tendencies. And so I do think that this stands with many other films of the time as an exploration of post-war violence brought home, and especially the clash of the post-war male and the post-war female. I mean, there's a lot of feelings of potential emasculation that a woman in 1950 is not comfortable going back into the role that she was narrowly confined in pre-war. And this film is playing with that a lot in really interesting ways. So that's my thought.
Interesting. There's also a little, I think it's a little shot at another film we've discussed in this series, and another film that deals explicitly with post-war trauma, where Bogart and his buddy sort of say, it's been so long since we've seen each other, and the other one says, well, why would we want to relive the worst years of our lives? So that works because the film is sort of an inside Hollywood sort of thing a little bit, but it also is making a commentary on that film's depiction of that time as well, I think. Spencer, you have a question or comment?
Yes, well, my first one is a comment. You were saying that you never believed he did it. I think when I was watching the film, I started off believing, of course he didn't do it. And then as things happened over the next hour or so, I kept thinking, oh, he probably did do it. He probably did do it. And then when he sends the two gifts to the hat check girl and to the man he almost killed with the stone, I'm almost convinced that he's done it. So that was my first comment. Mm-hmm. My second one is, I think my favorite moment in that movie was when he is in the kitchen and he is cutting the grapefruit in half, and he takes the grapefruit knife and he straightens it. And then she comes in and she explains to him that the grapefruit knife is, it's meant to be bent. And he has no idea. It's such a human moment in that movie that I really liked.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the interesting things about it. I mean, I tend to focus, and I guess most critics tend to focus on the sort of more tumultuous aspects of the characters in the film. They talk about people being laid bare and how revealing this is about human nature and human behavior. But that is a great example of a moment where this does the small things in a sort of interesting and more authentic way. I also kept thinking about, as annoying as it was, the way they kept saying, don't vacuum when the other person's sleeping. I found that to be another sort of like really kind of mundane human element that is an interesting sort of counterbalance to the more sort of high-flying, melodrama. Lisa.
Yeah, I'm delighted, and I mean this nicely. I'm delighted that you actually wondered if he did it, because when I watched the film, I think the film is trying to make it very clear that he did not, but I think the film is also trying to make it very clear that Laurel doesn't know if he actually did it. The script, the working script, the one that they were shooting, initially had a scene where Laurel sees Dix close the door after Mildred leaves, and then Kessler follows her. So the initial script had it very clear that Dix did not do this, that Laurel saw him close the door, and that Kessler is the killer. Ray decided to take that out because he wanted to introduce more ambiguity about whether or not Laurel did actually see Dick's closed door. When we see Laurel and Dix have their little, lock eye moment while Mildred is in the apartment, it's while Mildred is still in the apartment. She is not, we do not see her see him close the door. And so you're wondering, well, is Laurel just giving him this alibi because she trusts her instincts that he didn't do this? Did she see him and she's just telling the truth? And then, as the film progresses and her suspicion increases and she's talking to Sylvia, it begs the question very directly, did she actually see him close the door and bid Margaret adieu? So it's such an interestingly layered film in that we, the audience, at least I suppose most of us read it as right from the get-go, he didn't do this. But Laurel does not perhaps know that he didn't do it.
No, I think you're right about that. And I think that's the source of her inner tension, which, as Joss pointed out earlier, in the second half becomes partly our tension as viewers as well. Robert, you have questions or comments?
Thank you, Andrew. I was wondering whether you and Lisa might comment on what particular gifts did Nicholas Ray bring to this film that maybe other directors would not bring.
Okay.
I guess that was
Okay.
the main thing.
I appreciate that. I have a couple thoughts, but Lisa, if you have some ready to go, by all means, jump
Sure.
in.
And I think I saw this in the chat, some commentary about the kind of architectural layout of the spaces in this film. And one thing that I think Nick Ray really brings to this is a gem-like precision of the architecture of these spaces that people live in and are reflective of more emotional architecture. Like, so Nick Ray did study architecture actually under Frank Lloyd Wright. And I feel like in all of his films, there's this exceptional attention to emotional and physical architecture. And there have been so many words or ink spilled over the main setting of this film, the kind of hacienda-like apartment complex, which was based on Nick Ray's first apartment in Hollywood. And it's just such a beauty of construction that really speaks to the interiority of Humphrey Bogart's character, where you have Laurel, she's upstairs and he's downstairs. There's already this kind of power dynamic at play. There's that wrought iron fence work in his bed, separating his bedroom. It just speaks to how caged he is. And then his windows are just this tangle of endless curtains and window bars and all this stuff that is metaphorically and physically obfuscating his view. The architecture of any given Nick Ray movie is fascinating, but especially here. And I would extend that even to the architecture of the relationship. I mean, and this is not specific to Nick Ray, I'm just extending the metaphor a little bit, but the composition of the two characters in the relationship is so interesting to watch shift while they're happy. There are some of these compositions when they're in the happy period where they're directly on the same level, on the same playing field, and then that just shifts so dramatically in the latter portion of the film. So I will add architectural awareness to the discussion. I'm sure Andrew has many other thoughts.
I agree with what you said. I think about, you talk about architectural awareness, I think about an important scene in Rebel Without a Cause where James Dean comes back from the police station with his parents, and they're in sort of the living room near the stairs in their house. And there's an interesting sort of, people are situated within that space in a very interesting way correlating to the dynamic between the different family members there. I think another thing that Ray brings is an ability to really get actors to, break through walls, to really have them sort of unleash themselves as performers, to be raw. I think you see it in this film with Bogart. I think you see it in Rebel Without a Cause with James Dean. I think you see it with James Mason in the film I'm Drunk, where he plays the opioid addict. I can't remember the name of the film.
Bigger Than Life.
Yes, thank you, Bigger Than Life. And I think that we often forget, because we're focused on visuals, which are important, that a director really, his or her first job is to help guide the actors through the film. And I think he's exceptional at that, and that has comes through in this movie. So I think that's one thing he brought to it. I think another director might not have been able to get Bogart to be as un-Bogarty or whatever as he does. The last thing I would say is I think Nicholas Ray is not afraid himself to be misunderstood or to be disliked. And he has a sort of, he doesn't suffer fools, and he has a sort of, iconoclastic element to him. And I think that comes through in the Bogart character. And I think that communicating that, and also not being afraid to make films about unsavory people. That's very common nowadays, but not everybody was so interested in doing that back then. I think those are some things he brings to the table. Richard and Barbara, Barbara and Richard, you have comments.
Hi, Andrew, it's Richard. I'd like to introduce the question of the scene with Martha the masseuse, which seemed to me pretty clear that she was at least Nicholas Ray's or Hollywood's understanding at that time of a butch lesbian. But that scene, the way that it's shot up into her face, Gloria Graham is presumably nude, the way that she kind of speaks to her, and that's where the first doubts seem to be planted for Laurel about the real nature of Dixon Steele. I read a number of articles online, under queer studies, which, in addition to pointing out the name Dix Steele, mentioned that there was, an allusion to, as much as Hollywood could go there, but it's also the person that Laurel reaches out to by phone in the scene in the restaurant when they're celebrating the engagement. So I was wondering if you could comment, on that aspect of the film, and also if either of you know how that character is played in the novel.
Thanks, Richard. I don't know how that character, or even if that character appears in the novel. You are absolutely right that is how Hollywood coded lesbians at the time. Not saying it's fair or right or accurate, but that was, Hollywood had certain tropes, and that was one of them. I think it's interesting. I think that I feel like there are others. I can only think of one other movie where there is a suggestion of a woman who has a reputation for being a heterosexual woman who has a reputation for being, a bit of a party girl, and perhaps more social than is thought to be proper at the time, having a sort of, coded lesbian confidant, and that is Rebecca. The head of house in that film, it seems to be the closest confidant of the first Mrs. De Winter, and that's a dynamic that I feel actually you can even sort of suggest, you could even kind of in a way throw Mildred Pierce into that if we think that Eve, I'm drawing a blank on her last name, but her best friend in that film is somewhat coded similarly, although not entirely the same. So I think there's something to that dynamic, that there's something about that sort of character is able to cut through all the stuff with men and kind of give a sounding board to the main female character, and tell her things that no one else will tell her, and hear things or receive things that she can't tell anyone else. I haven't given this too much thought. I think it might have something to do with it being made clear that that person is not a romantic rival. And so there's not any sort of confusion on our part about whether that person is sort of, gunning for the man that they are talking badly about. But like I said, I haven't given it too much thought. Lisa.
This could be added into the column of what does Nick Ray bring to this? Who else would include the scene with Martha? Nick Ray was bisexual, and many of his films can be read with a queer subtext. I think it's widely accepted that Rebel Without a Cause has the first, gay teen character in cinema, Sal Mineo's character. And I love this scene with Martha because yes, it is codified as, as you said, a butch lesbian, but it's a way of extending Laurel's universe. I mean, she has this confidant who cares about her and who, it could possibly be seen as muscle, behind her. If Dix does her dirty, Martha will step in, and clearly she calls Martha to help her get out. So I see it as, yes, kind of playing with a little bit of maybe gay camp, like the exchange when Dix is knocking on the door and he says, "Are you decent?" And she says, "No, I'm with Martha." I mean, it's funny in a way, because it's playing off that stereotype. But to me, Martha is pragmatic and she cares about her, and not necessarily sexually. It's just a way of expanding her autonomy, and through a female character. Like, one of the things that I really cannot underline enough with this film is how much, for a film of its time, it accords screen time to women in solidarity, like women either alone, watching men, thinking about men. Like, there are so many shots of, say, Sylvia really kind of studying Dix and thinking about how he's acting and thinking about him, and women talking about men's actions, dissecting men's actions, making decisions based on their conversation about men's actions. Maybe this wouldn't pass the Bechdel test today, but I think that for 1950, it is an extraordinarily unique film. Not unique, but a film that accords a lot of screen time to women really taking a raised eyebrow to men.
Janice, you have a question or comment? No, okay. Diane, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, so there were two comments. One is, I'd like to hear your thoughts about why Dix sends the flowers to the coat check girl. I understand why you would send money to the motorist, because that motorist was still alive and wanted the money to fix his car, but I couldn't quite figure out the real reason that he would send the flowers, and we never hear about that again. And then the other thing is about the ending of the movie, which I thought was great. I think I read that that wasn't the original ending, that they were going to have kind of a happy ending, but this ending seemed like a great way to make it ambiguous and better. So I'm glad that it did end that way.
Thanks, Diane. Regarding the flowers, I took that to be a gesture along the lines of are coming from the same place as the way he treats that actor, that sort of past his prime alcoholic actor, that he sees people, he can be terrible, but he can also see people in need of grace or in need of acknowledgement, and he's willing to provide it to them. I also think that perhaps he thinks that, if she had, he doesn't know who killed her, right? So I was going to say, if he'd left her alone and she went on her date, maybe things would have been different. They wouldn't have been different because it ends up that her boyfriend is the one who killed her, but he doesn't know that at that time. And I think, like any of us might, if you had altered the plans of someone who a few hours later ends up being murdered, you might think, did I not facilitate, but create an opportunity for something to happen to this person that might not have otherwise. Lisa.
Yeah, I think it's, and I'm glad you brought up the two instances in the film where he is contrite, but shows his contrition through money. I don't think he ever says sorry for anything he does. I don't think the words "I'm sorry" issue from his mouth, but he does show contrition, and that's really why I do find this film to be, and I know this is a controversial opinion with some of the questions and comments we got in, I find it to be a very tragic love story, because he is sociopathic and probably awful all the time, but he has ambitions of being a better person that are not possible, but he only really knows how to show his contrition through gifts, money, and through private moments, I suppose. And about the ending is so fascinating, because they shot the ending as it was written in the script, where Dix kills Laurel. He strangles her, and then finishes writing his script, and Brub comes, the police arrest him. That's the script. That's the ending that they shot. And then Nick Ray thought, this is not working. I cannot have this be the ending. It does not ring true to me. And in later interviews about changing the ending on the fly, he sent everyone away except for Bogart and Graham and I think Art Smith. There was just those people on set, and he filmed the new ending, which is what we get. He says in interviews later, romances don't always have to end in death, or in very poignantly, marriages don't have to end in violence, or marriages don't have to end in death. I forget the exact wording, but clearly Laurel and Dix were not married yet, so maybe that's a bit of a Freudian slip, but I think he could have so easily made this a misogynistic fantasy about killing the wife, Gloria Graham, that he didn't love anymore, but he had enough insight into his own behavior, and I suppose the way that relationships end, that he doesn't need to kill Gloria Graham to make this a deep tragedy. And I think the film is so much stronger for its ending as it stands.
Yeah, I agree. In one sense, if he had killed her, that would have been, in some ways, I guess in a lot of ways, an even more sort of down ending, something Hollywood that was anathema to Hollywood typically at that time. But this is the one thing, the ending the film actually has is the one thing that was even worse or I shouldn't say worse, was even more feared by Hollywood at the time, and that is an ambiguous ending without closure of some clear way. Hollywood's conditioned all of us, particularly in those decades of the 40s, 50s, 60s, to expect the relationship to to there be a button, a sort of narrative button put on the movie, or there be a satisfying ending, usually happy, not always, but at least satisfying. And this movie doesn't have it. But we've been so conditioned by that. And in 1950, to have that sort of ending where it doesn't end as badly as it could, it certainly doesn't end as happily as it could, but it ends with these people having learned, hopefully it seems, and benefited from the experience, at least Bogart maybe has, but not being where either of them wanted to be at the end of the film. That's one of the things I think that makes it really stand out, and is the reason it has been viewed with such esteem over the intervening decades. Dana, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I do. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
So I have a very different take on this movie, and just bear with me here. First of all, no one's mentioned this, but one of the things that I found really intriguing is this is a film about a screenwriter. And we've seen other films about writers who have either had large or small parts in other films in this series. And it's always intriguing to me that writers are always well portrayed in movies, for the obvious reason that somebody's writing a script, and it's interesting and probably enlightening and fun to write about a writer. So I think it's very important that he's a writer. And I think it's very important that he's in the entertainment world anyway, because the way I read this film, and I haven't read any critic who said this, so I could be really off the wall, but I saw this as a story of a man and his muse. I saw Humphrey Bogart in the beginning of the movie as somebody who was desperately in need of writing a script, and he was looking for a muse. I don't know that he knew it consciously, but on some level, that's what he was doing. That's why he picked up the hat check girl. She was the first possibility. He thought he'd bring her in, she would tell him the story, and she would become his muse, but he soured on her pretty quickly because I think because his muse perhaps needed to be a sexual individual too, as is often the case. So then he gets Gloria Graham, and she turns out to be the perfect muse. It's set up in the police station the next day. She says all and does all the right things. She's got all the right moves. She's sexy. She's taken with his celebrity. And it sort of explained to me why their relationship clicked so very quickly. At first I thought, wow, who falls for somebody this quickly? But then, yes, you do. If you're looking for a muse, that happens really quickly. And she was playing very beautifully into the muse realm. So I saw this whole story, and it was a tragic love story, I thought. But it was a writer and his muse, and when the muse went sour on him, went bad, when she started to feel like she needed to get away from him because he was a scary guy, and she was right, he was sort of beginning to get rid of her. And I thought the scene in the car, he was contemplating killing her, perhaps killing himself, and that's the direction that he was going in. And I thought the commentary on men and their muses, and this might have some relationship to Bogart and The Call, and even Nicholas Ray and Gloria Graham. I just thought it was all sort of interestingly intertwined that way. And for me, the movie was really terrific as that kind of a study. So there you go. It's different. It's nobody else has said it. I didn't read it, but it really did strike me that way. And that's why I thought they were such deep performances too, because I really do think they came from the heart. So thanks.
Thank you, Dana. That's a really interesting reading of the film, one that hadn't occurred to me. And I have nothing to add except I'm glad people now can think about that way to think about the film. Lisa.
Dana, I love that take, and I am going to use that as a bit of a jump off point to rope in the Hollywood satire that this film is also dealing with, because I feel like that folds in nicely. I agree entirely that Humphrey Bogart's character is entirely revitalized by Laurel's presence. I mean, he is working around the clock. He has this great little typist character who's now You know, a almost 50s housewife taking care of him and then also inspiring him. But I definitely think that the film is playing with the idea that Hollywood is everyone has a hand in making Hollywood churn out bad movies. Like pre-Laurel, Dix couldn't care less about adapting this, you know, schlocky book into a screenplay. You know, I respectfully disagree with your comment that he thought he might have a muse in Mildred. I think that scene is so interesting and really, you know, some people have commented about the Me Too era resonance of this film. Humphrey Bogart changing into a bathrobe, I think is just as icky then as it is now with the Harvey Weinstein element added in. But I love the ambiguity of that scene because he clearly does not have motives that are just let this girl tell me the story. Like there's something more there, and I think he's deciding in the moment, you know what, she's not doing it for me. So I'm not going to get involved. So I don't know if he was looking for a muse per se. I think he viewed her cynically as, you know, quote unquote, his audience. And he was just going to have her tell him the story because he was too lazy to actually read this book and try to do an adaptation of it. And I think that the film is making Nick Ray is making some interesting points about, you know, if this is the screenwriter and this is the director, the popcorn salesman, the director that he interacts with in Paul's, the bar, you know, if these are the people that are in charge of producing our films, of course they're going to be bad. Like I think there's some kind of trenchant, very subtle insight into the lack of care that Humphrey Bogart's character has in adapting this to begin with. And then of course Laurel comes in and revitalizes him, and he created something apparently worthwhile. So I love your thoughts though, Dana. I always look forward to hearing them.
It is after 7:30, but I'd like to get to the last 5 people. So if everybody could just kind of keep their comments or questions on the brief side, that would be very helpful. Our next person up is Howard. Howard.
I have a question about the very end, and it's clear that Laurel wants to rid herself of this monster. And we now see that she's getting a call from Captain Lochner, and she learns of the innocence of Dix. And I think that she says that if I learned it yesterday, it would have made a difference, but today it doesn't matter. And if I heard that right, I was just kind of puzzled why that one additional day didn't in fact make a difference.
You mean why does it make a difference?
Yeah, why did it make a difference?
Right. I think it's because in that day, he really flies off the handle more than he has at any other time. He slaps his longtime agent. His paranoia about who she's talking to and what she's doing is at an all-time high from what we've seen. And I think she's seen him at his worst, or we hope it's his worst, and she's made up her mind. And if she had had that information earlier, she would have approached things differently, which would have meant he would have approached things differently, and she wouldn't have seen those sides of him to that degree, I think. Lisa.
So on learning that, there was no opportunity for redemption.
I don't understand how that follows.
Well, in other words, if she had learned, she learned a day later, and I use that phrase loosely, she learned that now he was innocent, that he hadn't committed a murder. So couldn't she now take that and say that, you know, he's not such a bad guy, and maybe my thoughts of him being a monster who had killed someone is just a pipe dream, and there's an opportunity to continue to pursue a relationship?
I think she could have thought that if she hadn't seen him slap his agent, this kindly old man who's only ever tried to help him, hadn't seen the controlling way he tried to micromanage her life, and hadn't seen his outburst with the motorist. If those things hadn't happened, regardless, great, congratulations, he's not a murderer. He still did all those other things while not being a murderer. He might not have done those things if she had known earlier that he was innocent, and then she would have approached things differently, which would have meant he would have approached her differently. But those things have been done. She's seen him do those things. She's heard him say those things. And murder or no, those things are not things she's interested in being around. And that's why it's too late. Lisa.
Very, very quickly, I'll say, and I'm going to try to condense this comment. I love how the film plays with time. And for example, we see them in this like 50s ideal. Well, she's the housewife, he is the typist working hard, and you have no idea how much time has passed. Like it seems like it's the next day, but in fact, it's maybe 2 weeks later or something. And then, time becomes a quick trap. Like he needs to get married now, today, answer me in 10 seconds. And I love that line because, yesterday doesn't need to mean yesterday. It's too late. Like Dix is waiting at the door to see her response to the news. And she elegantly says, this would have mattered some other time, but it's too late. And to me, that's just a very elegant way to close the conversation for good. I do not take it as even literally meaning yesterday I would have been on board. That's my thought on the line.
I like your answer better, Lisa. And I think it's a much better line, in talking about the screenplay, it's a much better line to say yesterday it would have mattered than there was some point in the previous 28 days when that information could have been useful. But so you're right. I think you're right. It's maybe not literally, but that's the way to say it because this is art, not an actual person actually talking. Janice, you have a question or comment? No. Kathleen, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I do. Thank you for suggesting the movie. I enjoyed it. I just wanted to quickly say how much I enjoyed some of the secondary characters who provided a lot of comic relief in this tragedy, like Sam the agent and the thespian, the actor, the older actor, and even the Kochek girl. I thought their performances were really good.
Yeah, I mean, the film definitely needed some levity, needed some range of character type, and it's supposed to be about Hollywood, right? There should be some colorful characters. Lisa, anything to add?
I'm good. You got it.
Then
I've
Janice.
been trying to, yeah. Is
Okay,
this
go ahead.
Janice? I've been having, is it all right to talk?
Yes, go ahead, Janice.
Okay. I felt that Humphrey Bogart's performance was a marvelous performance of an abusive man. I felt that, I mean, we've all been talking about how he was the various violent behaviors, but I mean, I know it wasn't a term that was popular back then, but to me, it seemed like an abusive man, very controlling. And when it came to the ending, I was rooting for her not to find out, for Laurel not to find out that I mean, I always knew that he hadn't killed the hat check girl, that was not what he had done. But I felt that she had really she was lucky that she didn't find out, because it would have been a disastrous thing from then after. So that's what I wanted to say.
No, I think you're right. And I think part of the point of the film and part of the reason that, I mean, as I said toward the beginning, I mean, part of the reason people, I think, appreciate this film, at least from a historical perspective, is because we feel that there's something about the makers of it, at least the male makers of it, that is being laid bare in it. That Ray is saying, yes, there are these things in men, there are these things in creative men, there are these things that that are terrible. And he could probably, I wouldn't be surprised if Nicholas Ray could never bring himself to apologize to someone he was in a relationship with while he was in a relationship with them. But he makes this movie that is his way of saying, I have these things in me, and I'm gonna tell a story about someone who has these terrible, unsavory things in them. Lisa.
I also, and I feel like I've seen this comments in the chat pop up. The abusive behavior is tacitly accepted and perhaps even expected by the men in his life, like because he is this genius artist. The violent behavior is never questioned, and even when his agent gets smacked in the face and breaks his glasses, that's just Dix. Like, he just accepts it. And this film, to its absolute, I mean, I'm just so impressed with this film in 1950, saying that is not okay. Like, the film is definitely on the side of leave this abusive man. Like, the film approves, in my estimation, the film approves of Laurel leaving him because he is violent. And I think that is a remarkable stance for this era where you frequently did not get movies about domestic violence, maybe at all. I really do think the exploration of male violence and how that pervasive culture is allowed by other men. The one line that sticks out to me, Brub says, he's an exciting guy. Like, it's just so, it so comes down on the side of the women that I do wonder if, Nick Ray and Bogey were co-signing that 100% as much as this film does. It's just such an interesting thing to think about, how much the creators of this put themselves in it and how much they believed in what I and what other people are getting out of it today. It's very interesting.
Linda, you have another question or comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to focus on Gloria Graham for a moment and her performance. She's really an interesting actress. And even when you consider the 1950s, I mean, this woman goes beyond the 1950s, and she has a contract. She's the almost ex-wife, I think, at that point, of Nicholas Ray. So she's found in bed with his son and eventually marries him. But here's a woman in the 1950s who goes beyond the 50s requirement for women's role, and she plays it in the film, and she makes breakfast for Bogart's character, et cetera, et cetera. But then in reality, she is way ahead of all that stuff. Now, maybe she's into immoral, depending on your point of view of a character and what women should or should not do. But beyond that, it's an interesting dichotomy that exists on set when this film is being put together.
Yeah, no, the backstory and the similarities and the differences between the backstory and the film. I mean, you could write a book on it if it hasn't been done already. Just because we're short on time, I'm just going to go right to the last person, Lisa. I hope that's okay. We've got Manuel with the last comment or question. Or we don't. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. We do one of these pretty much every Monday, unless it's a holiday. You can find out about them by signing up for our weekly emails every Thursday. We send out an email that has the upcoming film for Monday, links to how you can find out where you can rent to stream it, or stream to rent it, and a link to the video of the person the co-moderator who's made an introduction. You can also see on the screen, thank you for doing that, Heather, our upcoming remote classroom seminars. These are standalone Zoom classes of 75 to 90 minutes on a variety of film-related topics. We've got a number scheduled between now and the end of the summer, and we'll have some more into the fall as well. You can find out about all of these things and sign up for our emails and see what new movies we're showing through our Theater 5 program at brynmarfilm.org. So thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate your interest and attendance, and we also appreciate your support however you can give it. So thanks very much, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you next week. And thank you, Lisa, so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone. Great chat.
Take care, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, thanks.
Thank you.